All right, you guys. So I've got with me a very special guest. I've got with me Gregory Hardin II, host of the Green Corn Rebellion Show. He's a socialist on YouTube. You should check him out. He's got a great channel. So we're going to be chatting today about all this crazy stuff going on. We're going to be chatting, trying to get to know him, hear a little bit about his thoughts on some of the stuff going on here. So, but first, how you doing, man? How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing as good as I can. I mean, 2020 has been a wild year. I'll say that. I mean,
I
it
mean, it's been
started.
a wild decade, you mean?
No kidding, dude. But 2020, I'll tell you, 2020. I mean, this thing started out. How did it start? It started out the first few days. We thought we were going to get into World War III, right? And
Yes.
then it went to Iowa caucus. We had a weird app debacle. Pete
Mm-hmm.
Buttigieg. It was like Pete Buttigieg was going to steal the election with his weird app, and there was some weird stuff going on. Then the Democratic establishment collapsed in, trying to crush Bernie Sanders. Then we had more disasters. Then we
Yeah.
had COVID. Now we've got these massive protests going on. So when I said to you at the get-go, to set up this conversation, I said I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how the left can move forward in light of some of these struggles going on. And at the time, I had in mind a lot more to do with like Bernie Sanders. But clearly, with
Mm-hmm.
some of these protests going on, it seems like the mood has shifted a little bit. How do you think? What are some steps do you think we might be able to take?
Well, I mean, there's still several primaries in state houses and in Congress that we can pay attention to. A couple of those have went our way, and we still have some more to work towards. We can donate to those races, or we can phone bank for them. Probably be the most effective thing to do. Um, and yeah, so there's that, and we still have the chance to build up leftist organizations like DSA. I'm a member of DSA
Hmm.
and things like that. So the way forward is there. We just have to do it.
Now, I have a question then, because a lot of people are getting worried when it comes to the protest. They're like, is there really a message behind the protest? Because some people are there because they're upset about the death specifically of George Floyd. Some people are upset, because of general, the history of systemic racism in this country. Some people are there. I mean, there's all kinds of different reasons. And there doesn't seem to be, at least from some of the people there doesn't seem to be this clear set of, okay, this is what we want. This is the policy that we want. And some people are getting worried then that the protests could just be, they might not end up getting things done. Is that a concern for you, or do you think that at the end of the day things are still going to change because of them?
I mean, it's raised so much awareness, and people in the media are at least saying that it's because of George Floyd, and people know that George Floyd's death represents the systemic racism that's happened in our country for years and within the world for years. I am concerned in the actual how people in power, and elected officials, how they are going to actually act on these things. I
Mm,
mean, I've seen people and it's more or less at the local level that you're going to have to see these changes be implemented because, like, some of these things in terms of like policing are local things. These are handled
right.
at the local level. And so, here in Oklahoma, I've seen meetings being held at city council, and it looks like there's probably going to be some things changing in Oklahoma City and in Norman, which is a really great thing because the Oklahoma City area is one of the highest places for police killings in the entire country. I was shocked to see some of
Mm.
those statistics being thrown around about cities here in Oklahoma, like Tulsa. And so, yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that things will change. It's definitely brought a lot of awareness to it, and the awareness has not been, shortchanged. Usually it's like a couple of days people are worried about these things and talking about these things, and then we kind of just forget about it until the next killing of an unarmed black man or black person. And this time I see the energy has kept going, and we're having an
Yeah.
even better conversation about it now.
Yeah,
So
I
yeah.
I do. I feel like this time might be different, but I also might have felt that way in 2014. That was kind
Yeah.
of 2014 with Ferguson and stuff. That was really in some ways my activation moment into politics. I mean, I was always sort of following it, reading the news, but it was with Ferguson that I was like, okay, this is a really big problem and we need to get into politics. And I definitely hear you, by the way, when you're bringing up how this is largely a local issue, right? Like, so much of the energy is focused on the national issue, on the national side of things, on how Congress needs to act. But it does seem like there's a lot of local concern when it comes to this. The issue that I guess, been wondering about when it comes to police reform and local elections is that, you know, when we talk about police, they have a lot of leverage over city government. They have a lot of leverage, right? I actually worked for a very short amount of time in Fairfax County, which is a county in Northern Virginia near DC, the DC suburbs. I worked in their government for a couple months over the summer and then in the semester. Um, and what I noticed was the police chief was always there, man. And Fairfax County is supposed to be like a pretty powerful county, right? A lot of people who work in government in DC live there, but the police chief has so much leverage because he knows everybody who knows everybody. He's got all the connections.
Yeah.
He's been doing it for years. He worked his way up the ranks in a way that local officials, yeah, they connect with the community and then they run for office, but they're there for a few years, man. They're not there for decades. How do you feel
Yeah.
about that? Is this even overcomable? Is that a word? I don't know.
Well, yeah, because in some cities, positions like police chief are appointed by the city council,
Hmm.
and oftentimes the reason why a lot of the police chiefs stay there forever is because they know people. They're able to get that approval to just stay in that position forever, and it has very little to do with their effectiveness in that position or their ability to properly you know act within the community. So yeah, I don't like. I remember, I believe the mayor of Oklahoma City. I'll shit on him for a little bit. He tried to make it sound like he couldn't do anything about the police in Oklahoma City and whatnot. He put out this tweet. He said, "Let me educate y'all a little bit about local government. It's the city manager that hires the police chief or whatever." And it's like, okay, but the city council and you approved the hiring of the city manager, so you do have some sort of effect there and influence there. So like it's not as hard to overcome as some people may
Yeah.
think. It's just you have to apply pressure to your local officials, and they have elections every 2 to 4 years or whatever, and you can
Make
have
those
your say in
demands.
the
Yeah.
exactly. And there's city council meetings, I'm sure every week or every month, and you can make your voice heard in those meetings. And that's an easier way and a quicker way to affect change, because I don't think Congress can really do a whole lot with these issues. I mean, I'm sure that they could, but a lot of these things do have to be on a community to community basis.
Yeah, so then, I mean, when it comes to these local elections, local officials, I mean, I mean, at this point, it seems like you're asking a lot of democracy. Like you're asking people in local, like, to get involved in like local issues with like traffic stops, with like the way that the homeless are. I mean, this is something that's I'm passionate about. That's concerning my local government, in fact, Fairfax County, the way that the police officers interact with the homeless in our county. I mean, you're asking people to get involved in really detailed things. Is there room for changing that around, or is that just the way things are?
I mean, it's kind of just the way things are. I mean, it's the way things have always been. It's just we've had decades of people not wanting to get involved in their community. Maybe it's because the politicians make them think that they've got things handled or whatnot,
Yeah.
and people have been able to just fall out and not be able to do things. But at the local level, there's a lot of power there that people need to exert. And, it's pretty much as simple as going to a city council meeting and stuff like that, or tweeting at your city councilors or your mayor and whatnot. Because, that's it's a lot easier than try to contact your congressman or your senator, where they represent,
Right.
hundreds of thousands of people, but your mayor might only represent a couple thousand people or just several thousand people, and or your city councilor might only represent 30,000 people or something like that. It's
Yeah.
easier.
That's
Yeah.
that's definitely one of the big paradoxes that I've noticed when it comes to politics, which is that everybody wants to get involved on the national level. Everybody wants to get involved in that sexy national level, the, on Capitol Hill, they want to be doing that stuff. But in many
Yeah.
respects, the change can happen on the local level. You can have, as an individual, much, much more impact if you only voted down ballot than if you only voted top of ballot. But, how many people do that, right? If you're going to go in and vote and you're not going to vote for everybody, you're going to go top of the ticket. Most people don't go in and then only vote for their local and state officials, right? But this moves into an interesting question that I've been thinking about, which is the role of media in all this, right? Because one of the ways in which media, especially like, we're talking CNN, MSNBC, that they've really been able to boost their ratings is by focusing in on these controversial national hot button issues. And that's how we get people excited about this. But in many respects, that has not carried down to the local level, understandably, right? Because you can't get ratings for that stuff. But is it like, I suppose the downfall of that is that leads to polarization, right? That makes people just like unable to hear one another. Is there a role for, I don't want to say polarizing, but you know, making exciting, get your dopamine streaming for local elections, local debates when it comes to the media.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have my show is so I can interview candidates who are running for office here in the state legislature or for some of the city council seats in some of the smaller cities here in Oklahoma. Because, like, as far as like progressive issues or progressive candidates or whatever, it's easier for us to get elected in these offices when there's less people that you have to reach out to, so you can build a better consensus on certain things than you can if you're running for, president or Congress or something like that. And oftentimes, a lot of these candidates, they don't have any outlets to go to in order to get their message out there. So, I've had people ask to come on my show, or I've had people who have been really happy that I asked them to come on my show and talk about their race and what they're about, because even the local channels, they're corporatized, like they're
Mm.
not, I mean, they might be advertising or talking about local things and maybe sometimes local issues, but their perspective on those issues are very limited and whatnot. So that's where people like YouTube or the internet, people need to be putting out their own resources and having their own outlets in order to talk about these things.
So how does that though relate to like moving things forward for the left, right? Like, because there's sometimes I hear lefties, and I'm not in any way saying that you said this because you didn't. But sometimes people on the left will tend to think that, oh well, if we just got more democracy involved, then people will wake up and they'll agree with sort of left wing issues. You also see people on the right saying the same thing, like, oh well, if more people just got involved, they would just agree with me. Um, how do you think that we can use independent media to get people aware of left-wing issues and also get people aware of local issues? Is there any way to do that, or is that just you shoot and maybe you get lucky?
I think in some ways it is you shoot and you get lucky. I mean, if you talk about something that is important, then, people are going to want to listen as long as you're able to get that info to people.
Mhm.
You know, it's kind of just depends. I mean, sometimes on the internet, some things are by chance that you find something or that you don't find something, but there's no use in not bothering. There's no harm in trying to try
Yeah,
to
yeah.
talk about these things and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fair. So actually, I wanted to ask you because I saw you tweet out something not too long ago. You were tweeting out "defund the police," and that's definitely become one of the major rallying cries for a lot of progressives, a lot of people on the left when it comes to police reforms, when it comes to these protests. Again, we're trying to figure out what things we want to do, right? Like, how do we actually like? What are the things that we're asking for with these protests? So, you want to defend that a little bit? Give us the argument for defunding the police.
Well, the argument for defunding the police is the police have a strangely abundant presence in certain communities. mostly with the militarization of the police and whatnot, and the over policing of certain communities. So the argument is you defund them, you demilitarize them, because those two things kind of go hand in hand, and you divert those funds to other things within the community, whether that be
Hmm.
mental health or other types of things like that. And that'll make you fund things within the community to make the community better. Therefore, you'll have less of a reason to have so much over policing,
Hmm.
and whenever you take away a lot of the extraness that the police have in order to just terrorize their communities, you can reform the police in order to make them more, you know or I guess in a lot less, terroristic in a way, I guess is the word
Right.
I'm looking for. So therefore, you will have police that are able to be trusted within their community and stuff like that. So that's kind of the issue around defunding the police. It's not, oh, take away, give pay cut or stuff like that. It's talking about how in a lot of cities, the most of the budgets are like like heavily
Yeah.
go towards the police, and that's not necessarily helpful. So yeah, that's kind of what that is.
Yeah, because I hear on one hand, I hear this argument, this rallying cry of defund the police. And then on the other hand, I hear this argument that the police should be more like social workers, right? That they should be more engaged in their local community, maybe even, rename them. They don't need to be police in a certain sense. I've heard people saying things like that, right? But then I wonder to myself, it seems like, well, if you're going to make them be social workers, that requires a bit more training, right? And if you're going to do
Yeah.
something like that, it seems like you're talking about paying police officers more and then demilitarizing them. Um, is that sort of what the rallying cry is from your perspective for defund police?
Uh, yes and no. I mean, like we give police officers way too much to do. Like I think whenever it comes to like people call the police whenever someone has mental issues and there's a problem with that, and I don't think the police need to be involved in those issues because oftentimes the police ended up just killing them, and in those
Right.
instances we do need to actually have a social worker, and we need to be actually putting more funds into social work. So that's actually what we need to be doing with that, not so much allowing the police to be able to handle those issues, because
Right.
there's actual crime that is what the police should be handling, not so much every single disturbance or problem in the world that they're not taught to actually be able to deal with. So yeah, that's where I am on that.
Right. So I hear you in some sense, and tell me if this is right. I don't want to misrepresent you. I hear you gesturing towards something which is pretty interesting. One of the ideas that I've been, I guess, sort of flirting with in some sense is this idea of abolishing the police. And what's meant by that isn't this idea that we abolish law enforcement. It's this idea that we abolish the idea that one single institution should be enforcing all laws, right? So police is an organization type in which all domestic law enforcement for a particular jurisdiction is enforced by one jurisdiction, right? So enforced by one institution, right? So if you separated that and you had, one category of laws, whether it's traffic laws, and then, you have sort of drug busting laws, to the extent that you think drugs should be illegal, and the various different kinds of laws are enforced by different and separate, completely separate institutions, you would have abolished the police in a certain sense, and you could have more specialized training in that way. Is that something that you would be amenable to? Is that like a good idea, or is there a difference between, I guess you might say, abolishing the police, questions of rhetoric aside, and defund the police?
I think defund the police is more of a reform measure, in my opinion, but abolishing the police is more of a complete and total change of system in a way. I'm not opposed to what you were talking about, where we abolish the police, not in the sense of abolishing all law enforcement, but we just change the way that law enforcement is done, where it's not so centralized in you know one police precinct that has to do ABCD, the entire alphabet. because at the end of the day, you are still going to need, police officers to be able to, deal with robberies or certain violent
Hmm.
crimes and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, does that answer your question? I
Yeah,
think that's what
yeah.
it was. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Now, I want to ask you though, because it does seem like, when you're talking about defund the police, right? You're talking about redirecting resources to the community, especially the struggling areas of the community. One of the things that I've been sort of realizing is that, well-resourced communities don't need strict police enforcement. They don't need aggressive and violent police enforcement, right? In some sense, maybe we should rethink the entire way this whole thing happens. We talk about law enforcement. Well, we need to have more police because we don't want more violence. Well, maybe even in instances where, you watch the video and the police officer was justified, right? Like 100% justified those few times that it is, maybe we should still look at that as a failure because the police officer, in some sense, still had to enact a kind of violence on an individual. And that individual was like, we should look at it as our society failed to provide the resources to that individual. Everybody's got a story, man. Everybody's got a story where, at some point they decided, all right, I guess crime's for me, or, whatever it is. I don't really know, right? Um,
yeah.
how, I mean, is there a way to reformulate that, right? Because it seems like on one hand, it's hard to have a nuanced conversation about policing in this country, right? Like it's either you're pro police or anti police, it would seem.
Yeah.
But is there any room for a dialogue broader than that, do you think?
Yeah, because there's a lot of countries where I can't remember which country it was. It's one of the Nordic countries, where everything's way better than it is here.
Right.
Where the police hasn't killed anyone in like 10 years. That seems like a win to me. I'd like to get there because we talk about how, the problem is that they're disproportionately killing unarmed black individuals and whatnot. And, I hear a lot of people bring up like, "Oh, well, don't you know that they kill percentage-wise more black people or more white people than they do black people?" It's like, "Yeah, but like at the end of the day, like they're still killing people and you're just claiming to be okay with that?" Like,
Right.
like I'm not going to say that in every single instance someone shouldn't have died, but like there shouldn't be so much violence in our country. Like what drives people to be able to get to the point where they're going to be that violent, where the only way to deal with them is we take them down in a violent way, um and that does involve having, a better welfare system and a better education system, better way that we treat workers and whatnot, because oftentimes a lot of crimes end up being because, people weren't able to provide for themselves in normal ways that most people would be able to, right? So, it gets larger than just the conversation has to become larger than just how we police people. It has to be how we raise people, how we actually treat our citizens from just like childhood.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I've been wondering about, I guess, is the role of policing itself. Because we've all seen these just terrible videos of police just abusing people, and during these George Floyd protests, we've seen, police officers just hitting people, police officers just pushing people down, shooting rubber bullets at people for no reason. Um and I'm almost starting to wonder whether or not the role of policing is even just like fitting for a human being. I know that's like a weird way of putting it, but like the amount of mental stress, because some people, they turn around and then they say, oh well, don't you know policing is a really really tough job, so that's why it's okay for them to accidentally kill people. But it seems like, well, maybe that's a problem. Like maybe the job itself is just a nightmare for humans, where you look at this video. I was watching a video last night, and police officers, they needed a car to move, right? Because a car was just kind of sitting there. And like, in some sense, like I get it, right? Like you need the car to move because a car can't just be sitting there, right? And what
Yeah.
do? They shoot a canister of tear gas into the car to get the car to drive off. And obviously he opens
Hmm.
up the door, starts yelling, "There's a pregnant woman in my car!" And he's all
Oh
mad.
wow, there was someone in the
Well,
car.
there's a
Okay.
pregnant woman in the car with him, and he's obviously mad, like, why are you doing that? Why? And then, so what do? They start shooting rubber bullets, start shooting pepper bullets at him to like, hey, just move on, move on. And I'm thinking to myself, what normal human, what healthy human, what like in
Yeah.
a stable mental state is like, okay, I need this car to move. The best way to do that, I got it. Let me shoot tear gas in that. What healthy human does that, right? And
Yeah.
it made me wonder to myself, like, man, like maybe this whole thing is just a nightmare. Like maybe just people shouldn't be like we've got to completely redo this thing because you look at statistics, something like what 40% of cops beat their wives or 40% of them are some kind of domestic abuse
Yeah.
situation. I mean, those are terrible statistics, right? I mean,
Hmm.
controlling for all other factors, it's still an issue. Um, I don't know. Is this? I mean, this is just sort of a new sentiment I've been having. Is this a sentiment that is reasonable, or am I just watching crazy videos and I'm going off the rails?
No, I mean, from what we've been seeing from these protests, it doesn't sound like an irrational thought to have, because it's just like the protests, like here in Oklahoma City, and I know in Tulsa, the stories have pretty much been the protests were peaceful until the police started tear gassing people.
Right.
And they didn't need to do that. The police weren't under attack in any kind of way. No one at the protest had any weapons. They had no reason to feel threatened. So it was just like they did that with no reasoning. And that's where the argument for demilitarizing the police comes in, because if they didn't have those kinds of weapons on them, they wouldn't be able to do that to protesters.
Right.
Like it's just like,
Hmm.
insane. Like we can have a police force that isn't, militarized to that degree where they just, kind of for kicks, just terrorize citizens whenever they're peacefully protesting.
Well, okay, then let me. I guess what I'm trying to get at then with that thought that I'm having there is maybe the violence that police are performing on people is the symptom of a deeper problem, right? Like
Yes.
when we talk about oh well this is police violence, we've got to stop police violence, and then you talk about body cams, is that just putting a band-aid on a bullet hole? Like maybe the problem is much deeper. Maybe I mean I don't again, this is just me like seeing some of these videos and being like, having some of the thoughts I'm having. I'm trying
Yeah.
to work it out with you. So I'm not saying I've studied this for years or anything.
Yeah. Like the body cams are important. Like I
Well, sure,
support
sure, yeah,
police having body cams and whatnot, but that's not the end all of the issue. I mean, at the end of the
right,
day, we still have these videos of the cops doing these horrible things,
right.
and
Okay, it's
we
like
need to. Yeah.
right. It's
Yeah.
like
Like
okay, it's like all right, I've got it. Instead of just letting cops shoot people and we don't get a video, let's have cops shoot people and we get a video of it. Right now, again,
exactly.
I'm in
Yeah.
support of it. I'm in support of it, and I do think it'll help. But I
Mhm.
start to wonder to myself, like, is it just that we've put people, human beings, in this role of policing, which is just psychologically stressing, that they can't handle emotionally, that just humans are not meant to fit to handle,
Mhm.
and then we expect them to act perfectly all the time. And I'm thinking to myself, like, maybe we've just got to like start from scratch. I mean, I was mentioning
Yeah.
abolishing the like, just scrap it, start over, do it again. We've got a problem. Houston, we've got a problem. I
Well,
mean,
Houston, Dallas, Oklahoma
yes,
City,
Houston, Dallas,
Minneapolis.
Chicago, Minneapolis, exactly, Los Angeles,
Yeah.
everywhere. We've got a problem because we're talking about, oh, well, right, because the debate is, oh, is it bad apples or is it a culture? And I'm thinking to
It's a
myself,
culture.
but here's the thing, Gregory. I'm thinking to myself, like, if it's a culture, then that would be like, okay, well, it's one, two, three, four, five places in the country, and we could talk. Okay, Houston has a problem. Los Angeles has a problem. But when it's in every single police department across the country, I'm thinking to myself, it might be deeper than a culture. Maybe the institution is creating the culture. I,
Yeah.
you think so? Yeah. I mean, like it's like maybe
Yeah.
the.
I mean, like, yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, am I going too
Yeah, because
crazy
that's
here?
because that's because we go back to the camera thing. Like I've seen people post things like, "If you see the police beating me up, don't film it. Help me." And I'm like, I don't think so. Like if I'm
That means
getting
I
beaten
get
up by
beat
the
up too.
police, I don't. Yeah, it's like if I'm personally getting beat up by the police, please film it. I like please film it. I want at least proof of it. I don't want proof of two dead bodies because you tried to help. You know, like I think the cameras are useful to a degree, but they're not useful for not actually, changing the way that policing is done
I mean,
and holding people accountable. Like that's the bigger thing, is that the holding people accountable part. Like I want to see people be put in prison for the things they do wrong. Like that's another big issue, is that we never see these people charged. Like we had this one lady, what was her name, Betty Shelby or something like that. She killed Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, and they fired her. And then a year later, she was working in the county south of
ugh,
Tulsa in the sheriff's department. So it was just like there was no accountability there. Like, yeah, sure, you can
right.
get fired, but you can go right back to having a job. Like, that's not cool.
Right. I mean, to be clear, obviously body cams do help, and having
Yeah,
people film it does help in terms of accountability. I mean, very likely, if George Floyd, if that thing wasn't filmed, if it was, maybe it happened a few hours later in the night and people weren't out walking,
yeah,
honestly, he probably would have gotten away with it, right? I mean, we saw the conflicting coroner's report, the conflicting autopsy. I mean, it leads me to think that honestly, yeah, like if there was not that camera on him, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't know. And he would just be out policing. He'd be out policing. Derek Chauvin, all those other officers would be out driving their cars around at this moment if those video
yeah,
cameras were not rolling. So I do think, yeah, there is a role when it comes to that, creating the accountability, which can then hopefully create a culture of accountability where, we don't have cops standing over there just watching while other violence happens because they know, oh, if I just stand there and watch, my ass is on the line too. So maybe, right? But again, I just go back to this stressor concern where, it's like, how could it be that in every single police department across the country, it would seem, there's a bad culture? Like that leads me to
yeah,
think that just maybe the job of policing is just is a disaster, and we've got to think of ways to make it less stressful, less demanding, less harmful to that individual because, then they go home and they beat their wives. I mean,
yeah,
that's not something that normal people do. Normal people don't do stuff like that. So clearly it's destabilizing them in some way, and it's inhumane, not just to the individuals being oppressed, not just to those being locked up, not just to those being murdered on the streets by violent police officers, but to the police officers themselves. Um
yeah.
and I don't know. Maybe I'm going crazy. Maybe I'm going crazy, man. All right. So I wanted to ask you kind of one last thing here, which is, we were talking earlier at the beginning about kind of independent media and moving forward on the left. We both sort of have YouTube channels, and, we're both out here doing our thing. And one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about mulling over is, when it comes to the algorithm, especially on YouTube, which is that the algorithm sends our stuff, man, to people who already agree with us.
Yeah.
And that creates bad incentives on two sides, at least, probably more. But the first of which is only those, or at least mostly those who already agree with us are again seeing our content. And the second thing is it creates an incentive for individuals like me, like you, to create stuff that only appeals to people who already agree with us. Now, there's a role for that. Don't get me wrong. Like, there's 100% a role for that. But then, the algorithm then also by virtue of that rewards people who like I'm obviously not going to name anyone, but like there are people out there on YouTube who kind of just grift by just saying the thing that's the most outrageous. um and I know sometimes I've even caught myself getting really outraged and been like, oh, let me turn off the camera, maybe this isn't something that I should
Hmm.
upload. um I don't know, is there any way around that, man? Is there any way around that?
I don't think there's any way around the YouTube algorithm necessarily, but there's other forms of social media where that's less of an issue, like
Mm,
on Twitter or on Facebook. I mean, maybe Facebook is kind of like Facebook, or it's kind of like YouTube in that way, but on Twitter, I still end up like there's a reason why I have like 50 or 60 different accounts muted of like right wingers and stuff like that. Is because those tweets end up eventually seeping into my feed because of whatever reason someone I know retweets them or whatever, or someone I know quote tweets them to dunk on them or whatever. So like that's a way of, in my opinion, that's a way of breaking that, what is it, confirmation bias cycle, in terms of the left leaning YouTube channels only circulate you to other left-wing YouTube channels and
Mm,
whatnot, and stuff like that, because and that's why like I'd like to see another version of YouTube hopefully take off eventually, where it's a lot more fair to users and whatnot. But I don't see that happening. It seems like YouTube kind of has a monopoly on that kind of a thing. I mean, YouTube is still, in my opinion, great. I mean, it kind of
right.
sucks a lot of ways, but it's still a good outlet to get info out there. I've had people find my channel who are here in Oklahoma who I didn't know prior to them commenting on my videos or following me on Twitter, and they found me through YouTube, and I was like, "That's surprising. How'd that happen?" They already agreed with me, but they were still able to find my channel, and I still feel like we're gonna be able to build up media in that way. And I know that a few months ago during the campaign, MSNBC was put under pressure to possibly find more left wing commentators to end up being hired on the MSNBC. They have a handful of good people on there, like Sam Cedar, but they eventually are going to have to, pony up and hire more people, and those people will end up, going on those shows and whatnot. Like they had Ben Dixon on quite a bit during the election, and I've had Ben
Hmm.
Dixon on my show, and Ben Dixon has given me shout outs on his show, and that kind of feeds the tunnel of, MSNBC, not so much a left wing audience, but
Hmm.
it's feeding
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
towards other audiences that way. Like it's slower than but
Interesting. Yeah.
it's slower than the old YouTube algorithm where you might search Ben Shapiro, which I mean this might still happen, but like I know people who said they were fans of like Ben Shapiro, and then they were watching a Ben Shapiro video, and then they found a video of like someone debunking him, and then that's how they got into like Kyle Kalinske and David Pakman and something like that. So that those kinds of things always happen, because I think the majority report for them, they found out that their way of getting that crossover is debunking the people on the right in your
Mm,
videos. Therefore, you have a reason to tag them in the videos, in the sub, uh,
interesting. Yeah.
in the subscription or whatever it's called. So yeah, like there's other kinds of ways. I do think that it's still going to be possible. It's just harder because of the algorithm. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's really interesting. I had not thought about it that way before, thinking about that like pipeline to getting into more mainstream and things like that. Because I've always been wondering, like, okay, well, we've got to build another alternative, like, an alternative to YouTube or something like that. And it's like, well, that's a great idea, but then where do you get the users to actually then watch the stuff on that, right?
exactly. Yeah,
It's like, I mean, that's just a massive overhaul. Like, you'd need literally every single left wing commentator to be like, okay, I'm only posting on this site now, right? Like, that's the only way that that you'd be able to get any kind of move like that. So it's super super difficult. Um,
yeah. And then like on MSNBC, like you've had like people like Kyle Kalinske and David Pakman have been called on to channels like CNN or MSNBC to debate people and whatnot. So they're not complete and total hired commentators, but people like that do eventually get called onto those shows in
event,
order to
yeah.
halfway promote themselves. And that's another way for audiences to be able to, see the other
Hmm.
people. So yeah.
So let me ask you then. So one of the things that I don't know if you've heard of him, Nathan Robinson. He writes for Current Affairs. I think he founded
Yeah.
Current Affairs. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
been
yeah. I know who he
yeah
is.
yeah yeah, he's been talking a lot about building like a lefty, like a leftist, like cable news show. And I have conflicting feelings. Sometimes like I feel like in general like I'm 100% like I'm not like opposed to it, right? To be clear,
Mhm.
but I do sometimes wonder if is that the old way? Like is that just the past and and we need to be talking about building, building networks online, building institutions online. Um I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I think it's a really good idea, cuz like we do have like in this past election, we did see the where the divides are, right? Like we've seen that young people, I mean, I guess you can consider that people under 40, tend to get their news and their media from Twitter, from Facebook, from YouTube, stuff like
Mhm.
that. And then people over 40 or over 45 tend to get their media from cable news and whatnot. Like it, and I think in some ways the politics of people who are older, whether you want to say it's just the boomers or the Xers, their politics are going to be different. But it's not like a lot of those people were opposed to left wing ideas. They're
Mm.
not opposed, like most of them are not opposed to Bernie Sanders because they oppose Medicare for all and things like that. They just didn't think that he could win an election, a general election against Trump. But I also don't think it's a bad idea to have a cable news show that promotes left wing ideas in an honest way and talks about things like that, and still manages to get that perspective out there. Like if there was a left-wing cable news show like MSNBC or CNN or something like that, or even just like an entire channel for leftists that was like a cable news channel. I mean, we do have certain channels like Free Speech TV that are left-wing and I think get quite a few million viewers every week or whatever. But it'd be cool if we had like a actual leftist news show on one of the like big cable news channels, like MSNBC or
Oh, okay.
something.
So you,
So like I'm not opposed to it because it's like there's always going to be people viewing cable news even regardless of age. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at on that. It
so
also depends on who's hosting the show too.
right. Well, for sure. Yeah. Well, so for instance, like Cenk Uygur used to have a show on MSNBC, and then I
Yeah.
mean he claims he was fired. MSNBC, I don't think they say that he wasn't fired or whatever. Cenk says that he was told that he had to censor himself or whatever. Um, I don't know, because I mean it does seem like cable news does have those extra sort of corporate, like they have to appease the corporations because they have to sell the advertising slots, right, in order to make the thing
Yeah.
profitable, because it's just so expensive to have a cable news show, right? So there is a little bit of certain kind of like corporate bootlicking that's required in order to do something like that. Doesn't that kind of dilute the,
Yeah.
you think so?
Yeah, it does. It does, but at the same time, like they're able to have, like, as far as they've gone within the last several years, is have certain commentators on that will give like a good leftist perspective on things. I don't see what would be the problem with giving a token progressive a 1 hour or half an hour show in like the middle of the day or something. Like I don't think that's going to
Right.
be as big of a problem as like give us the 7 or 8 o'clock time slot where Rachel Maddow is and whatnot.
Mm.
But I at the end of the day, the their model of how they do things is going to eventually die out. Like no one's going to be wanting to watch MSNBC or CNN anymore because most of their audience is 50 and up. I don't know if you know this, but people tend to die. So,
What?
like, I don't know, but
People
yeah.
die? What? This is news to me. Yeah.
But yeah, but I think that even when it comes to just like left wing media in general, there's just not a lot of money to be made. I mean, like, sure, you do have instances of people like Chapo Trap House who make lots of money on Patreon and whatnot. But like in whenever it comes to left wing campaigns, like they don't tend to out fundraise the corporate candidates. So like the issue with cable news is they still need ratings because there's no sense of advertising if you're not going to have ratings. So, they're going to have to give in at some point, in my opinion. They're going to have to, give in.
That's it. They're going to have to give in at some point. The left wing wave is coming. You guys, you heard that. You heard it here first. The left wing wave is coming. We're all growing up. Gregory, thanks so much for joining us today. You all can check out all of his information down in the description. I'll have it down there so you can all check him out. Follow him on Twitter. Find his YouTube channel. All of his stuff. Go stalk him. Send him weird, creepy DMs. All that stuff. All right, you guys. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks for joining us.